Thank you very much, Eva. Well, this is one of our lectures on what we call the Transatlantic Perspectives, where we sort of discuss a number of issues that is of relevance for the transatlantic relationship. And I think it's safe to say that the Arctic is actually one of these areas that maybe has been understudied in many areas. And of course, in the Nordic region, among the Nordic states, we have greater interest than many others, of course. But I think the Arctic region is full of the complexity that we'll be looking at today. We do have the environmental security threats. We have geopolitics that is playing out quite rapidly. We have a military security issues all over the Arctic that is developing. And of course, we do have energy resources, foodstuff, etc. So the Arctic represents in many ways a sort of a small microcosmos of international politics. And today we have 4 excellent speakers that will look at different angles of this this challenge. We have Dr. Lassi Heininen, and unfortunately, Dr. Lasse Heinenen have a bit of a problem with his video, so he will only have audio. He's the professor of Arctic politics at University of Lapland in Finland, professor of international relations at Northern Arctic Federal University in Russia. We also have Dr. Marc Lanteigne, professor of political science, the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. Then third speaker will be Maj Gen Randy, who is the executive director of the Arctic Domain Awareness Center at the University of Alaska. And then finally, we have Miss Erika Olson, who is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service Office and now the director for Northern European, Baltic and Arctic Security Affairs in the Bureau of Europe and Eurasia of the United States Department of State. That's a long introduction there. But these are 4 very distinguished speakers who will sort of look at this from very different angles. And I think that we will have a incredibly interesting presentation. But you all have lined up not to listen to me, but rather to listen to the speakers. So I would like to invite Professor Heininen to make the first presentation. Lassi, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Niklas. And I'm really sorry that the video doesn't function, but I'm not hiding. I'm even probably weird. So it's good afternoon. It's very big pleasure to me to join this webinar. Interesting and relevant topic. I was thinking that the topic of the webinar that yes, there have been and are significant changes in the globalized Arctic, as well as there is a continuity. The nuclear weapon systems of the USA and those of Russia represent the continuity. Then new security premises, environmental, human and societal approaches of security due to environmental degradation, climate change, and the joint commitment of the Arctic states to maintain high geopolitical stability represent the change. It's interesting to find out that the Arctic states have went beyond hegemonic great power rivalry and Cold War costs when they have reconstructed their geopolitical reality by considering environmental protection and focus on science as means to achieve common aims in order to decrease military tension of the Cold War and increase stability. And that, of course, indicates that there are common interests behind there. And you can consider, you can interpret that environmental degradation and climate change mitigation are taken as means for a paradigm shift, or at least there is a potential for that kind of shift in Arctic security. As well, in that at this moment, it can also play a chance, a possibility to reset transatlantic relations as well as relations between the USA and Russia. If we think about the very interesting situation of world politics today, the Biden administration will start next week, will resign Paris Agreement, will tackle COVID-19 pandemic, and doing that will try to have CO2 emission neutrality as an exit strategy. On the other hand, Russia is interested in to continue arms control. There is Yamal LNG and progress in Northern Sea routes, much supported by Russia. And then Russia will start soon its chairmanship of Arctic Council. So you can think and interpret that the Arctic is a common ground instead of a front. And if I will continue, I can even say that traditional hegemony, great power rivalry rhetoric in the Arctic context is passé. It's neither smart politically nor honest intellectually, as Arctic stability has passed several tests and seems to be rather resilient. Instead, there are new things, new trends, and we just published 1 year ago an analysis on Arctic policies and strategies of the Arctic states, indigenous peoples organizations, and observer states of Arctic Council. And among those trends are the first one, an ambivalence or paradox in Arctic development, when a balance is sought between environmental protection, climate change mitigation, and new economic activities. And behind is political inability of Arctic states to make the hard decisions. Another trend is state domination vis-a-vis internationalization, globalization, so that there are Arctic states who thinks that state sovereignty is still a very sensitive issue, and that's why not too much globalization. Then you have indigenous peoples organizations leaning on international agreements on self-governing and United Nations. And then you have UNCLOS as the constitution of oceans, including the Arctic Ocean. Then the third trend is focus on science. And this is very interesting and very obvious that both state actors and other non-state actors are leaning on science because of the rapidly advanced climate change. So science is asked to solve the problem. And of course, I mean, Arctic cooperation is very much based on scientific cooperation. And then finally, there is a new kind of relationship between the Arctic and space. So there are several similarities. Use the Arctic as a common ground to develop cooperation dealing with space, including satellites. So yes, the nuclear weapon systems, as I mentioned, are still deployed there in the Arctic region, but they are controlled. Instead, there are other challenges, uncertainties. like I mentioned already, environmental degradation, pollution, climate change, then pandemics, then in general world politics, populism, hate speech, based on the activities of big ICT companies without democracy. And then what I see there is some sort of underestimation and misunderstanding of the prevailing stability and possibilities for confidence building, so that we can build on that stability what we have. Well, in general, I don't want to sound dramatic, but by many ways, the momentum is now to continue to build on that stability and these achievements what the Arctic cooperation have managed to gain. Yes, there is a need to be concerned on China's growing great power interests, as well as Russia's instability, unpredictability. However, these both states they lean on science. They are committed on common rules when it comes to the Arctic. I'm more worried about, and I will stop here, I'm more worried about hesitation of the states, either the Arctic states or the observer states, to tackle climate change, environmental degradation, due to political inability, meaning to make the hard decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will not turn on my video. I will just ask Professor Lanteigne to start his presentation. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Lassi, for your presentation. Hello from Tromsø. I'm pleased to report that the polar night is going to be wrapping up in about 5 days, so we're all very much looking forward to the return of the sun up here. And what I would like to do with my session is to talk a little bit more about some of the points that Lassi introduced about specifically China's role in questions about Arctic security. Now, one thing that can be said when talking about this subject over the past few years is that there really has been a bit of a divide between talking about things that aren't there versus talking about things that are there. And one of the issues with US Arctic policy with the outgoing administration is that a great deal of focus was placed regarding China's role in the Arctic on things that were either not there or turned out to be not there. But before I go back to that, I just want to very briefly outline what China is currently seeking in regards to its Arctic policy. Now, first and foremost, and this is still a subject of a great deal of discussion in China and without, is the matter of scientific knowledge and scientific diplomacy. When academics in China started to refer to China as a near Arctic state, needless to say, it was not very well taken in some quarters. And the outgoing US government tended to use that as a sort of blunt instrument to say that, well, China's trying to be revisionist, it's trying to put on airs that don't exist. But talking about China as a near Arctic state, part of the rationale for the concept was the idea that what is happening in the Arctic is affecting China in numerous ways, including not only the obvious like economics and trade, but also changed weather patterns in the country, changed snowfall, pollution patterns, and so forth. And it also needs to be stressed that China is still very much a newcomer in the Arctic in regards to information. Yes, it has engaged with Arctic governments. Yes, it has been a very strong participant in Track 2 organizations. But a lot of really necessary information is still in the collecting phase. And that very much affects what China is and is not able to do in the region. The second point regarding economics. Now, it's very difficult to predict where the global economy is going to be going this year and in the short term. But what China is looking at is an Arctic with a great deal of economic potential and a very strong concern that unless Chinese companies, Chinese interests are setting up shop in the region, it will be shut out. Chinese scholars have referred to this as the melon problem, a scenario whereby the Arctic is cut up into 8 pieces among the Arctic states. And if you're not an Arctic state, you have very limited access. This is something which China is obviously very anxious to avoid. And the third issue, and this is the one which is probably going to cause a great deal of debate, is China would like to have a greater say in Arctic governance. And as I'm going to be explaining, China is hardly alone in that aspect. But obviously China, being a great power, being a potential competitor to the United States, China's interests in the region are getting the most attention. China's been an observer in the Arctic Council now since 2013. It has also been very active in other areas of Arctic governance, ranging from the recent fishing ban to the Polar Code. And Chinese officials have made it quite clear that while the country is certainly not going to be contesting the role of the Arctic Council, not going to be contesting laws in the region, that there is some space, if you want to call it, there is a little bit of a milieu in the question of Arctic governance where non-Arctic states could and should be involved. And it's that kind of amorphous space where things are going to get very interesting, especially as China's economy continues to grow. Now, one point to make about security, which is very key here, there's been so much discussion, again, from the outgoing US government about China's security interests in the Arctic. And the potential for growing military presence from China in the region cannot be discounted, but it's also very important to note that the cost-benefit ratio of China engaging in a very revisionist or unilateral or trying to push a hard security agenda in the Arctic, it really doesn't measure up for Beijing's interest. Because of the fact that China does not have any Arctic geography, it is still very much dependent on the goodwill of Arctic states, and that includes Russia, for a lot of its interests. And therefore, the cost of behaving unilaterally, kind of pushing, if you will, against Arctic norms and developing a hard security agenda, it would be very costly. And yet what we've seen, and probably the most infamous example of this was the Pompeo speech in 2019, there is still the tendency in American policymaking to portray China as a revisionist, as a country that is trying to create legitimacy in the Arctic out of nothing, and is simply not interested in what the US government called the rules-based order. And yet, looking at what has been happening with China so far in the region, there's been very, very little evidence, first of all, that China is attempting this level of revisionist behavior, nor does there appear to be any evidence that this kind of US pressure is having any effect on China's Arctic thinking. Now, certainly China's policies in the Arctic have run into some difficulties over the past 2 years or so. Leaving aside the situation with the pandemic, this is obviously a situation which is not just affecting China, but we also have the problem of China's attempts to kind of separate its Arctic policy from other areas of its diplomacy. In addition to the United States, China's also run into bilateral diplomatic problems with Canada, with Sweden, to a degree with Denmark. And that is starting to seep into concerns about, well, what kind of actor will China be in the Arctic in the near future? The fact is, though, and just to kind of conclude with these thoughts, China cannot be kind of leveraged out of the Arctic at this point. If there is an attempt to exclude China from future Arctic discourses, China is simply going to find a way around that issue, very likely with Russian assistance. Even though Russia is of the view that the Arctic states obviously have a certain set of rights and responsibilities in the region, Russia has also been very open to the possibility through initiatives such as the Polar Silk Road of Chinese economic participation. So the clue here, and I think that we're starting to see signs that the US might be kind of changing its tune with the new administration, with the Biden administration, first of all, going back to climate change as a priority in the Arctic, which is excellent news. But I think we're also starting to see the understanding that a lot of the security problems in the Arctic are best solved through multilateralism. And that includes the role of numerous non-Arctic states, including China. The second point I wanted to conclude with is, even though some parties are still very uncomfortable with this, there are many areas of the Arctic, including security, which are becoming internationalized. When Mike Pompeo made reference in his speech to the idea that there are Arctic states, non-Arctic states, and no third category, I mean, there were a lot of problems with the speech, but I think that was probably the core problem, in my view, with that presentation. Because China is not the only non-Arctic state with a very significant agenda in the region. And some non-Arctic states have even gone much further than China to say, hey, we are very concerned about security here. You look at the recent white papers that have come out from the governments of Britain, Germany, Japan, even Singapore has started to express concerns about how Arctic security is going to affect their interests. So the Arctic is becoming more of an international space. So the question is how to best convey the need for a better dialogue between the Arctic 8 and these non-Arctic actors. And you look at what's happening with the Arctic Council now, just very quickly. You have 13 observers, governmental observers in the Arctic Council, Switzerland being the most recent 3 years ago. 2 more states, Estonia and Ireland, have just put in their applications to be observers. So there is definitely a question of where non-Arctic states fit in the question of Arctic governance and security. And China, yes, it's the biggest state, and yes, it's obviously a country that needs a great deal of attention, but it's certainly not alone in that aspect. So this means that even though China might be kind of pushing this issue because of its size and because of its power, the fact is we are seeing a need for new forms of Arctic dialogue related to security, which will include large non-Arctic states and other non-Arctic states, including China. So I'll conclude here. Thank you.
Major General, are you? There we go.
Sorry, I was looking for the cue. My apologies. I'm right with you here, so thank you. First, I'd like to congratulate my previous preceding speakers and offer sincere thanks for their reflections. I think it's strategically important. Both issues that have been, issues raised by both of the prior speakers, and from my vantage point, I'll have perhaps some convergent thoughts to some reflection, but also some convergence on some of the others. My name is Randy Callsign Church Key. I'm a retired Major General of the United States Air Force. I have spent 30-some years in principally in Arctic, in military operations that included Arctic operations, also involved in Arctic security studies and Arctic strategy developments, et cetera, in the U.S. military. I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the Arctic Domain Awareness Center at the University of Alaska. I'm based at the University of Alaska Anchorage. I'm just outside that town here in a place called Eagle River, and it is absolutely a lovely place to be. Somewhat like living in a postcard, if I could offer that perspective. Also, in addition to my day-to-day job at the U.S. at ADAC, I also have the privilege of serving as a commissioner to the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, and also supporting the International Cooperative Engagement Program for Polar Research, specifically the lead of the Situational Awareness Working Group, as a multinational effort in science technology development for the Arctic region, for the polar regions, excuse me. Strategically, I also have the privilege of serving as a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in the Polar Institute as a global fellow in that effort. And then last, I have the opportunity to serve as an advisor to the governor of the state of Alaska when it comes to military affairs. ADAC itself, however, is here at the University of Alaska, is focused on science technology development for the United States Coast Guard in the Arctic region. So my day-to-day focus is advancing technologies and tools and capabilities and knowledge products, as well as educational programs, convening activities that benefit the Arctic operator, specifically those in the United States Coast Guard, but also being able to support the public good. In this aspect, I look at the Arctic and Arctic security from both prior experience in the military and also in my day-to-day job in advancing science technology, and then being involved in Arctic policy discussions, both within U.S. Coast Guard, but also supporting the United States military within Alaskan Command, a sub-unified command to U.S. Northern Command, and then also some colleagues in discussion points within the Department of Defense. So with those as backgrounds, as perspectives, if you will, I look at the Arctic from a multi-dimensional security vantage point. The Arctic is certainly has aspects that involve security in a traditional sense. That would be, if you will, both the law enforcement kind of security, as well as, if you will, defense or military security. I also look at it, though, from the vantage point of environmental security, and many of the projects we work on in our center are really kind of more oriented to understanding and characterizing the Arctic from an environmental security vantage point. Economic security, of course, is also an important element here, and specifically as you think about the economic security means of the citizens who live in the Arctic region, which today above the Arctic Circle is about 4 million people. If you lower that to about 60 degrees north latitude, in accordance with the Arctic Council's definition, you're really looking more of about somewhere between 10, 11 million people that are in that range, just a few degrees further south in the Arctic Circle. I look at, in addition to economic security, looking at the aspects of cultural security. The Arctic is home to indigenous peoples that have managed to continue traditional lifestyles that they've had for millennia. And in developing Arctic world of Arctic change, it is those lifestyles that are really quite under siege in some regards, and highly questionable how well they'll be able to muster forward and being able to still conduct traditional based lifestyles based on their cultural heritage. So cultural security is also another element to consider. The Arctic is changing. It is changing because the physical aspects that are as a result of a warming Arctic region. And it is warming more than 2 times the rate of lower latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere. Some recent reports showing it is now somewhere between 3 and 4 times the rate of lower latitudes over the last 2 to 3 years. As someone who lives near the Arctic, by the traditional sense of 66 1/3 degrees north, we're seeing this quite routinely in our part of the Arctic, if you will, the North American Arctic and the western portion of the North American Arctic. We're also seeing, of course, that as the Arctic region continues to warm, then looking at the aspects of as the physical terrain continues to change as a result of that, then you're seeing the weather patterns and such that are happening in lower latitudes come further north, where it used to be the Arctic was a region of relative weather stability. It is not the case anymore, specifically in the North American Arctic region. So in this aspect, as you see the physical changing aspects of the Arctic as a result of warming, things that impact lower latitudes are now manifesting themselves in the Arctic region. So it is making access, of course, quite much easier for folks to get here. That includes states, non-state actors, that includes industry, that includes individuals. And as a result, you're seeing a changing, in addition to physical changes, you're seeing a change in the human terrain of the Arctic region. State actors, of course, are making their presence known quite substantially. And you're seeing, as often talked about over the last several years, the aspect of great powers operating with increasing frequency in the Arctic region. Of course, not just great powers, but many nations, as my prior distinguished speakers have discussed. When you look at the Arctic from a region of stability, I believe we're all interested in multiple nations working together in the venues such as the Arctic Council, but also among national militaries for providing defense support to civil authorities in responding to crises such as search and rescue, disaster response, and humanitarian assistance, day-to-day hands of help mission where the militaries can be of great help in this regards. The United States Coast Guard is among other Coast Guard nations that are in and around the Arctic region, the Arctic 8, if you will, have the have the Arctic Coast Guard Forum where the US is a strong player. But we look at those mechanisms of multinational collaboration, cooperation are really ways to help keep the region as a region of collaboration and a region where we can solve our differences. We also, in our world in ADAC and others, and also as a member of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, we believe that science is a great unifier. And science has an opportunity to create for all of us a great venue to find common ground and to understand principally what's happening in the Arctic that we can learn from and apply and try to find ways to minimize the impact of a changing Arctic, a warming Arctic, in a way that reduces the threat to our citizens and to the region, of course, to the lower latitudes. In this regards, the Arctic is exceptional. It is a place, and I can say this from a background of being around a large portion of the planet over the course of my professional career. Compared to anywhere else I've ever served in trying to make a difference, it is a region, the Arctic region, whether it's the North American Arctic, the Transatlantic regions, or the European Arctic, and the Eurasian Arctic. All those regions are quite exceptional. For one, the magnificence of the location, the magnificence of the people who live there, the challenges we all face because in trying to find ways to find common ground, science is that unifier. And as a way to help keep the Arctic an exceptional place by focusing time and energy effort on this regards. It is a region, of course, as the Arctic continues to warm. There's three principal activities that are going to continue to develop at quite substantial rates, I believe. Number one, of course, it is a warming Arctic is providing access to regions that were previously inaccessible for the development of natural resources, whether that's a world of petrochemicals, minerals, marine life, those regions that the Arctic region provides now in a diminished ice environment, an opportunity for folks to get there and to access the wealth to be gained from the natural environment. It is incumbent upon all of us that those practices are done in a sustainable, safe, and really coordinated manner. In addition to this aspect of a diminished ice environment, we're allowing access to minerals, wealth, and marine life. Also, the aspects of of transportation. The Northern Sea route, of course, is one route that is proving increasingly commercially viable. We know that the Northwest Passage through Canada provides a route as well through the Arctic region, although it is much more complicated because of the internal aspects of ice in that region where you don't have a large ocean flow. So it is an area that's going to continue to be difficult. It's also quite shallow from a transportation vantage point. And then ultimately, as you look towards the future, you're seeing the transportation route through the transpolar route, where you have the opportunity of one, open space as far as national claims for navigation, but also in this aspect of unlimited draft. So in a region where the ice continues to diminish, if you're looking at least for a portion of the year in the coming decades, likely if models continue to prove accurate, you're seeing transportation through the transpolar route, which provide quite a remarkable opportunity for global commerce going between Europe and East Asia. Lastly, for me, when I think about the Arctic from a developing aspect, of course, that is of tourism. So industry, transportation, and tourism, and again, is an opportunity for, similar to science, being a great unifier area for people to see a remarkable place on the planet. Previous discussions regarding the aspects of the roles of great power competition, and the rise of great power activity in the region. Number one, I'm a big fan, frankly, and I think all of us who work in the science community would like to see science lead the conversation and serve as that great unifier and also a great stabilizer. But also that we have to deal, for those nations that have great power, to deal collectively and cooperatively in the Arctic to maintain stability. I think Lassi mentioned an important remark that Russia's instability in some of their decision-making sometimes is of great concern to those of us who live next door. And in fact, this last summer, there was some activities of a Russian exercise that actually operated into the U.S. extended economic zone in the Bering Sea that caused quite a bit of concern among local fishermen who were caught off guard in this exercise and frankly chased off of fishing grounds because the Russians were operating there. That kind of activity that is not poorly, does not well communicate, that cause an impact to citizens, there's certainly pause for concern. And the aspects when it comes to relationship of China in the region, there is much to be said about this, and I would look forward to pulling that thread further in the conversation. But the discussions I would look to is I look at practices that China has in other regions when it comes to environmental stewardship. Those kind of activities, if they're replicated in the Arctic, would cause potentially great harm. So while everybody has an opportunity to try to navigate in the open spaces of the Arctic region, the international waters, as they become more and more accessible, we of course believe as Americans writ large, and I'm not speaking of course for our government, but in this case, I do look at the ability for people to operate smartly in this developing region and opening ocean in a way that's responsible. I look at China's environmental practices in places like the South China Sea, South Asia, and Africa, is certainly not necessarily conducive to the environmental stewardship that one expects who lives near the Arctic to be accomplished. We expect the Arctic, people operating the Arctic to be responsible in their environmental practices. So while the aspects of Arctic governance, to me, I would look to say, is important for us to find mechanisms of cooperation and collaboration. We also know that the people who live in this region, the Arctic 8, should be principally driving the conversation when it comes to how the region's development, because this is where we live and this is where we should find solutions from the, if you will, from a resident's view. And folks are coming from outside the region can find the right place at the table, but they shouldn't be driving the discussion. They should be finding a way to work within the mechanisms. The folks that are living again in the region, they're trying to set this, responsibly set the aspects up for a developing region smartly into the future. So my last remark in saying this, first of all, thanks for the gift of your time to discuss this. I would offer that folks, when we look to the future, we need to find that the area of our common interests serving as the Venn diagram of where we work towards, by also maintaining the aspect the Arctic is a region of exceptionalism. Let's focus on the things that unify us. Let's bring strength to the table so that we can all act responsibly. And then finally, for me, let's look for solutions to help affect what happens. The Arctic, of course, is affecting the lower latitudes as far as a changing climate. Let's try to find ways to not only look to conserve, but also to find solutions and antidotes that to deal with the fact that a warming climate is something we are, especially at a warming Arctic, to us are ways that we can find solutions that can not only help our region, but the lower latitudes as well. Thank you so very much. I give the floor back.
Well, thank you very much. Before I give the floor to Director Olson, I would like to remind all the audience that you have the question and answers button, Q&A, at the bottom to the right. So feel free to start writing your questions already now. So because we have limited time, and I would like to give the audience all the opportunities to ask questions. But Erika, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank you and the Institute for Security and Development Policy for putting this opportunity together today. I really hope that we can meet together in person soon. But in the meantime, these virtual events are really important for sustaining our transatlantic conversation. And we're always happy to work alongside you in defense of our shared values, common interests, and security. I'll try to keep my remarks tight because, as you can imagine, my distinguished co-panelists have talked about a lot of the issues that I would like to raise. I find myself in a unique position in that I believe I'm the only one who currently speaks on behalf of a government. But I'm very happy to be here today to try to give a broader sense of the U.S. policy on this issue, even as we walk into, as noted, our transition next week. The Department of State has fostered strong diplomatic ties with Arctic countries, even before the U.S. officially became an Arctic state in 1867 with the acquisition of Alaska. And our relationship with our Nordic partners are some of the most important and enduring in Europe and date back to the earliest days of our nation's history. Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and Canada are NATO allies with whom we tackle the most pressing security challenges across the globe. And we also have important NATO-enhanced opportunity partnerships with Sweden and Finland. Our northern neighbors are essential to the transatlantic security, both in the Arctic and beyond. And we must rely on these time-tested relationships that are based on shared values and interests as we enter a new phase of strategic competition. During World War II, the United States worked with its Arctic allies, particularly Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark and Greenland, to establish bases critical to the war effort. During the Cold War, the United States and our allies maintained a robust presence in the high north and the Arctic, particularly with the establishment of the Distant Early Warning Line, which reflected the region's importance to our collective security in this era of strategic competition. Of course, as we all know, with the fall of the Soviet Union, our attention turned to other security challenges and our approach to the Arctic shifted. For more than 20 years, our principal concern in the Arctic has been on promoting cooperation, coordination, and interaction among Arctic states and indigenous communities on issues such as sustainable development and environmental protection. This approach manifested itself, of course, in 1996 with the 8 countries with territory above the Arctic Circle forming the Arctic Council. And I think it's important to note that coming into this 25th anniversary year, we continue to support a strong rules-based international order as one of the best defenses against malign actors and to enable us to work together to combat the environmental challenges we face. The Arctic Council, and as Major General Key noted, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum directly contribute to the increased safety and security of Arctic states and communities. However, at the same time, we have to adjust our Arctic policy to adapt to today's new geopolitical reality, which, as has been noted, is characterized by a return of global great power competition. A strategic change driven by the desire of Russia and the People's Republic of China to rearrange the global security order by challenging the United States and the West. And as we know, the Arctic is not immune from the implications of this change. And in fact, we should expect that the rapidly changing Arctic system, diminished sea ice coverage, declining snow cover, melting ice sheets, and thawing permafrost will create greater incentives for Russia and the PRC to pursue Arctic agendas that clash with Western interests. Their actions could jeopardize our collective efforts to ensure the Arctic remain a region of rules-based governance, stability, and low tension. Russia, as we know, is the largest Arctic state by both population and geographic area above the Arctic Circle. And Russia sees its Arctic region as critical to the country's economic future. Within the Arctic Council, Russia has cooperated with the United States on a number of issues, including education, oil spill response, and search and rescue. And as Russia takes over chairmanship of the Arctic Council from Iceland in May, we expect to continue to work constructively with Moscow in this forum. But that's not to say that Russian behavior in the Arctic does not concern us. Russia's restrictions on navigational rights and freedoms on the Northern Sea Route are inconsistent with international law as reflected in UNCLOS. Russia's reported threats to use military force to promote its excessive maritime claims in the NSR only magnify this concerning behavior. Moreover, Russia's malicious activities against other Arctic states, including cyber attacks against government institutions, underscore the destabilizing role that Russia can play. Russian military presence in the Arctic is also growing, as we know. Over the past decade, Russia unveiled a new Arctic Command, a new Arctic Brigade, 14 new operational airfields, new development of missile systems, and 16 deepwater ports, reviving many of its northern Cold War era bases and building new ones. Russia also maintains the largest icebreaker fleet in the world, with over 40 existing icebreakers, some nuclear powered, and even more in development. Just to give you a sense of a few recent developments, and Major General Key touched on one, that speak to Russia's growing military activities in the region. In October 2019, we witnessed the largest Russian military exercise in the European Arctic since the end of the Cold War, just off the coast of Norway. In August 2020, Russia conducted Ocean Shield, the largest military exercise in the Bering Sea since the end of the Cold War, with approximately 50 warships and 40 aircraft participating. During the exercise, Russian vessels displaced Alaskan fishing vessels, legally fishing within the US exclusive economic zone. On October 7th, 2020, which just happens to be President Putin's birthday, Russia tested its new Skiron hypersonic cruise missile and successfully hit a target in the Barents Sea. On October 28th, 2020, Russia released its new Arctic strategy, emphasizing the region's importance to Russia's military and security interests. And on January 1st, 2021, Russia's Northern Fleet was officially upgraded to the status of a military district. And as you know, the Russian military buildup in the Arctic has implications well beyond its waters. From a geostrategic perspective, the Arctic and the North Atlantic are inextricably linked. The Arctic provides Russian ships and submarines with access to a critical naval choke point, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, that is reemerging as a key front in NATO's defense and deterrence strategy. Underwater transatlantic communication cables, the foundation of our communication system with Europe, cross the same waters. In short, NATO's northern flank must once again command the attention of the United States and its allies and partners. I look forward to our discussion on the PRC because there definitely appears to be some differences of opinion, if you will. But we see the PRC presenting a very different challenge. Yes, its stated interests in the Arctic are primarily focused on access to natural resources and opportunities offered by the Arctic sea routes for shipping. But as we know, in 2018, the PRC launched its first Arctic strategy, outlining plans to develop a polar Silk Road as part of its larger Belt and Road initiative. This is disconcerting given the PRC's behavior outside the Arctic, as has already been mentioned this morning. For example, in the South China Sea, where it's disregarded the international law of the sea in asserting an expansive and unlawful maritime claim, and has taken provocative steps to restrict freedom of navigation and long-standing oil and gas activities of Southeast Asian nations. In this context, the PRC's military-civil fusion strategy raises questions about the ultimate purpose of seemingly benign activities of a dual-use nature. We need to track PRC activities in the Arctic carefully and push for transparency, particularly on its scientific and technological work with dual-use possibilities. How the PRC and Russian interests in the Arctic converge or diverge, since Russia would not necessarily benefit from this PRC playing out South China Sea scenarios, will also be vital to monitor. The PRC is pursuing great influence in the Arctic by seeking to grow its economic, diplomatic, and scientific presence. Over the past several years, the PRC has secured mining licenses for mineral deposits throughout the region, including for uranium and other rare earth minerals. In 2019, the PRC launched its first home-built icebreaker and has begun work on a new, potentially nuclear-powered icebreaker. The PRC maintains research stations in Iceland and Norway, and it maintains 22 Confucius Institutes in Arctic countries outside of the United States and Russia. And as we've seen across the globe, soft power tools often have a sharp edge when deployed by the PRC. The PRC has weaponized its state capitalism in an effort to secure control of critical dual-use infrastructure, such as ports, airports, and telecommunication networks. It's demonstrated a willingness to use coercion, influence operations, and other methods to get what it wants. And we've seen this in the Arctic. The experience of the Faroe Islands, in which a PRC ambassador threatened to drop a trade agreement if the Faroese government did not sign a 5G contract with Huawei, is just one example. Norway's efforts to protect the integrity of the Svalbard Treaty against potential inconsistent PRC actions, ensuring the island remain a base for only legitimate scientific research, is another. The PRC's pattern of aggressive behavior elsewhere in the world, the way the PRC has used money, companies, and workers to develop critical infrastructure in other parts of the globe to establish a permanent security presence, must inform our approach to the PRC's interests and activities in the Arctic. The United States is not arguing that Chinese economic investment or scientific research in the Arctic is unwelcome. We welcome transparent, rule-based engagement with the PRC, but the United States and its Arctic allies and partners must examine the PRC's activities more closely than we have in the past. The PRC's behavior over the last decade underscores that we cannot and should not assume its good intentions. We need to work with the PRC we have, not the one we wish we had. So there's been a number of encouraging developments over the past year, I think, as we start to try to address what is this shift in geopolitics and security in the region. And I applaud our Nordic allies for the questions that they are asking, particularly about the methods of the PRC in research that has dual-use technology that's not transparent, and in upholding also high standards such as environmental protection, labor provisions, transparency, and rule of law. So the ultimate goal for the United States is for the Arctic states to be each other's partners of choice. That doesn't mean that we don't welcome particularly scientific participation of experts from across the globe. But we really should look to each other as we look at science, research, and development across the region. And we hope to help accomplish this by increasing our engagement and investments in the region. As you know, in June of this year, we reopened our consulate in Nuuk to increase diplomatic and people-to-people engagement with the people of Greenland. It's now our northernmost diplomatic facility in the world. And we are looking to work both with the Arctic Council and with our bilateral relationships to strengthen what we're doing more broadly in the region. We also are looking at domestically at what we need to be doing to develop our own Arctic. As some of you might have seen in the recent NDAA, there's additional Arctic language there, speaking to our own military, our own research pieces. Additionally, we are taking a serious look at our own icebreaker fleet as we look to develop and build that up from what I'll say is quite a low level right now. I fear I've talked too long, but thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you to my co-panelists, and I look forward to a spirited discussion. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much. We have already received 2 questions, and I think that what Erika has sort of talked about in the end here, China, of course, and the two first questions really on China. And Jacopo Polverino, what action should China pursue to get more involved in the Arctic governance process without scaring the Arctic states? But then we also have Major General Mats Engman, who poses a question that goes in a similar fashion, in that China's track record in exploiting natural resource in the South China Sea and even in other areas are problematic from respecting international norms, the local people and traditions. What do you believe would restrict China to act in a similar fashion in the Arctic? Can we trust China being or contributing to preserve the uniqueness of the Arctic? And of course, Lasse was mentioned UNCLOS and all of this, which is China seems to accept in certain areas, but not in others. So there seems to be a selectiveness that is problematic. So why don't we start off with China as the first questions? Who would like to start?
I'll volunteer.
Yes.
I'm waiting. I don't want to get in front of anyone.
Randy?
I don't.
The floor is yours.
Maybe jumping into the lion's den, so to speak. Well, let me just offer a few points. I think that Ms. Olson really hit on some key areas, and I don't want to come across as being too militaristically minded. So I want to try to be very cautious in this regards. But I do believe that the aspects of adherence to the rules-based order, and I do believe that the selective use of mechanisms of international norms, and I would emphasize the word selective use, is what's the cause for concern. There's some confidence building measures of the PRC. If they're really genuinely sincere in trying to want to be a responsible actor in the Arctic region, there's some sincere commitments and measures they ought to consider and to take to change the perspective that the nations who call the Arctic home can see, can evaluate it, can look at to see, okay, these folks are changing their trajectory from where they have been and turning over, if you will, a new leaf. But I think that Erika mentioned something that I think is critically important here. We need to be eyes wide open. I've seen firsthand in some of the practices of environmental stewardship in South Asia, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia. And if those practices were to be applied in the Arctic region, I think the entire Arctic community would find that 100% unacceptable. And for the vantage point of mineral exploitation only and that aspect alone, it is of great concern. So strategically, in closing, practices, we need to see folks practice what they preach. And if they're looking to do this in a meaningful way, then they're going to need to do some confidence building measures, and also to admit, hey, we perhaps have not done so well in these other regions, and please give us a chance. We're willing to try. But I have to admit, I have to close with, we need to be eyes wide open. It's not only the aspect, of course, environmental, but economic coercion as well. And again, the soft power with a hard edge is something I've seen firsthand as well in those instruments that really put us up to be exploited if we're not careful. So I'll just let my other colleagues hop in, but first of all, emphasize some of the key elements that Erika has presented and echo them. Thank you.
Who would like to go next?
I could, here is Lassi.
Lassi, yes, please.
Yeah, I could respond to that first question about China. Well, I mean, we have already seen that China, as well other observer states of the Arctic Council, they play by the rules. There are even criteria when you apply observership, but in practice, which matters the most here, we have seen that. And I believe so far we don't have any legally binding agreement on the Arctic. So we have to trust that these common rules are enough, and people or actors will play by the rules. And of course, this is a confidence building measure. But this is because the Arctic cooperation is first of all functional cooperation. So this is what is exactly to build confidence, step by step. We have also, when it comes to UNCLOS, we have also done some comparative studies between the Arctic Ocean and the South China Sea. And it's clear that there are some lessons to learn from the Arctic Ocean, which can be applied in the South China Sea. It's of course it's a long process, but this might be one way to try to define common rules there and ask all the actors behave according those common rules. Thank you.
Erika or Mark, anyone who wants to tap in? No.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. There you go.
Sorry, Erika, did you want to go in?
No, Erika, you were on. Now you silenced yourself.
Thanks. Sorry about that. No, I just wanted to say I think I touched on this question pretty significantly in my remarks, and I would just echo what Major General Key said. I think that we have to be vigilant and aware. That doesn't mean there isn't space for cooperation, but as I said, with transparency and with our eyes open. That's how we can build this relationship, particularly as we're looking at science and other important elements moving forward in the Arctic. And I think we have to make sure that the positions we're taking as the Arctic states are based not only on what is said or even signed, but by what we see in practice. And I think that's going to be the most essential part.
If I could just add very briefly. No, excellent points, excellent questions. First of all, it is important to note that China is a great power, and obviously great powers do have a long historical tendency of pushing against rules and norms. So certainly this is something which has to be looked at very carefully in the case of China, not just in the Arctic, but in many other parts of the world. That said, though, I tend to be a little bit more skeptical than most about comparisons with the Arctic and the South China Sea, for the simple reason that we are dealing with very significantly different historical, legal, political, economic, etc., situations in both regions. And the first of which is being that China is not an Arctic state, nor has it made any indication that it wishes to change the legal and political status quo there. The 2018 white paper was mentioned. And it's important to note that that document was the first policy paper that Beijing released on the Arctic. And most of the paper had to do with what China is seeking from the region, including developing better diplomatic relations, developing better scientific knowledge. The one reference to security in that paper had to do with civilian cooperation on issues like search and rescue. Compare that with other non-Arctic states, such as I mentioned the UK, Germany, Japan, which have actually gone much further in discussing their security concerns in the region. And I think that needs to be taken into account. It's important when looking at the South China Sea comparison not to fall into an if P then Q trap. So in other words, China is misbehaving in this region, ergo it must be misbehaving in the Arctic. And as was just pointed out, it's very important to look at what is actually happening versus what exactly is appearing on paper. And what has been happening in terms of China's activities in the Arctic is still very, shall we say, not dedicated to hard power or unilateralism. A great deal of focus on developing an identity as an Arctic stakeholder, a country that can certainly participate in Arctic dialogues. China has been very careful because it knows that it's under a microscope compared to the other currently 12 observers in the Arctic Council, that it needs to make sure that its particular role as a stakeholder is not affected. That's why China has been very active in various legal regimes. I mentioned the Polar Code. China's also ratified UNCLOS and has really tried to ensure that its kind of scientific knowledge is still kind of maintained at the forefront. Completely agree on the subject of dual use and completely agree on the fact that we might be dealing with a slightly different situation once more of the region opens up. But it goes back to the point I made. We really need to be careful about looking at what is there versus what may be there in some amorphous future. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I think I would agree to that, but at the same time, I think it's important also to look at the track record. So I do agree the South China Sea and the Arctic is two very different. But I was actually intrigued when Lassi also mentioned the space development and the usage of space. Of course, we've seen how China behaved in the Pacific Islands, which is gives a bit of a concern. But we have another question here from Shakti Nandan about Russia. Up to a few years back, GLONASS, the Russian satellite, was the only surveillance system which was effective in providing effective communication. Has other stakeholders, US, Nordic nations, have been able to overcome that? The coherent surveillance of ice thickness, hydrographic mapping, etc., is also so critical, not only for commercial operations, but also for any military adventures from hostile nations. So, and Shakti has actually included her email, which I appreciate, in transparency, which I do appreciate. So anyone who wants to answer, have we overcome that? Randy?
I can start. Although this is not exactly my research field, but I mentioned that new kind of interrelationship between the Arctic and space. And actually Finland, who had the Arctic Council chairmanship before Iceland a few years ago, had meteorology as one of the priorities. And there, first time, the Arctic Council started to discuss about possible cooperation when it comes to satellites across the Arctic area, the North Pole, because there are not that many satellites. And I think that who made this question was exactly had a good point that this Russian satellite is one of the few ones. And actually in the meetings, Arctic Council meetings at the time, there was a representative of Russian company exactly representing this satellite that presenting what could be possible cooperation on that. But I don't know any real progress yet on that. But that is something what is under discussion, that what could be exactly the benefit of cooperation there.
Randy, you had a finger up.
I did. So I'd like to offer some thoughts. First of all, I love this question, and I will not monopolize, but I could actually speak considerably on this for a longer time than you probably didn't care to hear. One thing I would share several aspects, but the first one, there's a new memorandum of agreement of understanding, if you will, between the many nations regarding it's called the International Cooperative Engagement Program Polar Research, ICE paper. The memorandum of understanding is at this point, if I recall correctly, is Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Canada, and New Zealand. And in this aspect, it's intended to advance, if you will, the ancient stone soup approach, where nations work to common good in exchanging information and multinational approaches in science technology development that benefits polar operations. I have the privilege of serving as the U.S. Situational Awareness Working Group chair, and my lead is actually in the Danish Armed Forces, who's running the Situational Awareness Working Group for the entire enterprise in over-the-horizon radar, sensors, and communications. That's essentially, in many regards, positioning, navigation, and timing. ICE paper is just but one approach. The United States, of course, is advancing not only in the government-provided aspects in communications and connectivity, but also the commercial sector. We also know that our allies in Canada are doing that as well, both in the commercial and in the government side. So while there is certainly a lacking of communication and connectivity, positioning, navigation, and timing in the polar regions, the Arctic in particular, commercial and government efforts, both from a national vantage point, binationally in North America, and of course, multinationally in vehicles such as ICE paper, is closing the gap and shortfalls in technology for people to be able to operate safely. As someone who's flown extensively in the Arctic region, depending on the right day or the wrong day, you could be communications out simply because of lack of satellite coverage at that moment in time, or the lack of the right ionosphere for HF communications. So strategically, these advances I think are important, and more is coming sooner than later. And the ability to communicate and have connectivity across the Arctic region in the coming years and decades is going to be much more like the lower latitudes. So I'd offer that.
Anyone else want to put something in there?
Maybe I'd add just quickly that I think what Randy spoke to is exactly right, and I think that the challenge we've had over the last 20 years is we really haven't had a focus on these kind of communication, whether it's satellite, whether it's communication cables, as I mentioned, across the GI-UK gap. But how do we ensure that we have enough so that if there are challenges with communications, we have those backups, and that is so relevant whether you're talking about more traditional national security reasons, but also search and rescue, absolutely fundamental. Science, our National Science Foundation has a long-term presence in Greenland that I think has been useful to the scientific community across the globe. But again, that's isolated, and you need that communication and satellites to be able to do that. So I think that the Major General is right, and I think it's a very positive change in development for us all.
Thank you. I'm going to offer you each one of the speakers to sort of conclude a bit. And Johannes Nordin actually asked the final question. Do you believe trade will become an important force for more cooperation as smaller distant nations benefit from the major players' icebreaker fleet, or will security concerns, as cited by Ms. Olson, further divide the Arctic powers into camps? So it will be division. And I mean, of course, since this is a transatlantic seminar as well, I mean, I would like to pose the question, is the Arctic a divider in a transatlantic relationship, or is it something that will bring us closer together? Because the transatlantic link has not always been strong. It's been ups and downs. And is the Arctic a divide, or is it something that creates cooperation? So I'll open up for anyone to start. Or Erika, do you want to start?
Sure. I would just say, I think we're at a crucial point in time to find the answer to this question. And I think that the answer to this question depends on all of us who are on this conversation today. And I think it really depends. I know we had talked about internationalization of the Arctic, but fundamentally it depends on collaboration, cooperation, and transparency among the Arctic 8. I think trade, it's inevitable. I mean, if you look at the increase in navigable days alone in the Arctic space over the last 20 years, if you read China's polar white paper and the interest in transport there, and as someone mentioned earlier, the ability to significantly decrease the number of days in moving goods across the globe through the Arctic, those are all going to be, they're coming. So how do we ensure that becomes a greater area for cooperation and doesn't divide us is really the challenge I think that all of us are confronted with right now. And as to your question about the transatlantic relationship, I would just say this. I think there have been times, particularly in the post-Cold War world, where we've taken the transatlantic relationship for granted. We haven't, on either side of the Atlantic, done the spade work to ensure that relationship continues to grow and be strong. The foundations, the fundamentals, I would posit, are as strong as they ever have been. And now what we need to do is to make sure that we, whether it's on differences, we sit down and have real conversations, and then we continue to find ways to collaborate. And in the Arctic, it's so essential to enable us to continue to keep the Arctic a place that is based on rule of law, and is stable and is open to the good of the indigenous populations that live in all of our countries. Maybe I'll stop with that.
Mark, you're next on my screen, so I'll let you start, and then I go to Randy, and then I'll let Lassi end.
Okay, thank you. Yes, completely agree. And in regards to what is happening in terms of trade as a potential area of diplomatic cooperation, I think two kind of variables which are going to be important here. One was mentioned in terms of the legal structure in the Arctic, which is still very important. But I think the second issue is how this trade will not only benefit the 8 Arctic states as abstracts, but also the 4 million people who live in the Arctic. The question now is, as the Arctic continues to open, what will be the potential economic benefits versus economic problems that the population of the Arctic itself will face, and that includes indigenous organizations. Also, in regards to whether or not Arctic security will create a situation with the Atlantic relationships, I would say, again, a lot has to do with interpretation of rules and laws. But I would also want to add, again, looking at the Arctic states as kind of 8 blocks, if you will, kind of masks the fact that there have been very significant differences between the Arctic and non-Arctic communities of many of these Arctic states. I speak as one. In Tromsø, sometimes the political viewpoints are vastly different from what you see in Oslo. I imagine it's a similar situation between, let's say, Helsinki and Rovaniemi and others. So I think that also has to be taken into account, not only for talking about security, but also the subject of cooperation.
Randy, the floor, yeah.
Thank you so very much. First of all, I believe strongly in the transatlantic relationship. I have for my professional life, and I believe that the U.S. commitment in the transatlantic relationship, while in the press appears to ebb and flow, I know it's substantially at the ground level. Collaboration with folks that have been working this relationship for generations remain committed to this. So I do believe the transatlantic relationship between the United States, Canada, and our European allies and partners remains strong and remains a source of strength and stability for our planet. So I'd just like to echo that as a beginning point. I would say also, when it comes to the Arctic region, spending time with the folks and the indigenous communities in our respective nations, gaining insights from people who've been a part of the Arctic since time began, I think is critically important. The Arctic is exceptional, and it is exceptional in size, breadth, and depth of the collaboration in Arctic science, economic, indigenous people's concerns, and of course, and again, I would say military cooperation and government-related activities. I think compared to other places around the world, it's about the best there is. Continued exceptionalism, of course, is by no means assured. And we rightly need, in the transatlantic relationship, and specifically our respective nations, need to continue to invest in science, economics, and measures to ensure our respective security and sovereignty while working for the collective good. But we can't put that at risk, and we need to contribute those measures to ensure a stable Arctic. It is opening. It's a diminishing ice environment, and it's providing incentive for Arctic and non-Arctic nations alike to pursue easier access to minerals, harvest marine life, conduct transportation, advance tourism, and also project sovereign influence. That is actually happening now. We're seeing it. It is rising competition among great powers and medium powers, but such competition does not need to mean confrontation. We need to manage the tension, but we need not to turn into confrontation. We need to respectively among the transatlantic allies and partners respond collectively at strength. Russia, for one, respects strength. Two, we don't need to turn every problem that the Arctic has in security terms into a nail that requires a hammer. We need to find multiple approaches here to a way to diminish concerns, ensure transparency, and increase confidence that the actions being conducted are not harmful to other nations or other organizations. I will share lastly is that when it comes to looking at the problem set between Moscow and Beijing, we need to decouple approaches. We don't need to force Moscow and Beijing into more of a common set or feeling like they're threatened from a common adversary. That's not the point, and it shouldn't be. We need to respectively deal with each of those capitals differently, uniquely, because one, Russia has been in the Arctic as a nation for as long as nation states have been involved in the Arctic, and they're not going anywhere. We need to have a different approach with Moscow than we do with Beijing. Thanks for the gift of your time to listen. It's been a privilege to be part of this panel.
Lasse, the floor is yours. You can conclude everything. And
yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, that is maybe a bit too demanding, but I will respond to these two questions. I mean, first, transatlantic relations. I think that I partly dealt with that issue, saying that the Arctic offers and can play as a common ground now when trying to reset relations between, for example, European countries and the USA. But think about that Nordic cooperation is very much the core for Arctic cooperation, and it is already covering North Atlantic. Then if you add Canada, then you have already transatlantic relations, and then you have two big powers, the USA and Russia. So in a way, I see that transatlantic relations are inside there in Arctic cooperation, if you wish, and both are multilateral cooperation approaches. So absolutely, they can support each other. Then the question about trade. When we made analysis on Arctic policies, strategies, so it's striking how important economic activities, including trade, are. They are the first priority of the Arctic states and the second priority of the Arctic Council observer states, when science research is the first. And of course, there are many other activities, but trade is very much the core there. And so for me, trade is exactly one of the most important fields of so-called low politics, where you can start to cooperate. And by doing that, you can increase confidence. And think about that Arctic Council was not seen to do that alone, and that's why Arctic Economic Council was established when Canada had was second time the chair of the Arctic Council. And there we have indigenous peoples organization playing important role, because trade is very important also, not only for the Arctic state, but for the indigenous peoples. And that's why I think that it's a multifunctional object, vehicle to be used, and could be developed a lot more. And there, of course, Northern Sea routes play very important role. So we, all in all, I think there are many possibilities more when it comes to trade, what has been utilized so far. Thank you.
Well, so trade will save us. If nothing else, we do need trade right now after the corona pandemic has played out. I would like to thank all the speakers and of course also the audience for a very interesting discussion. I think we will have reason to come back to this topic. I hardly think it's gonna end within short, even if I thought I heard a lot of positive solutions and everything, but of course politics tend to get in between good advice and reality. So I would just I hope everybody joins me in a hand to congratulate the speakers for this. And then I would also like to, on the 20th of January, we have another presentation about Taiwanese consciousness and transformation, retrospect and prospect. So going from the cold north to the warmer part of Asia, so if you have time on the 20th, I would also welcome you to listen into that. But to the speakers again, thank you very much for an incredibly interesting discussion.